In the heart of the city, a simple taxi driver named Frank finds his world turned upside down when a gang of ruthless bikers decides to smash his cab. What they don't know is that Frank is not just an ordinary driver. He's a retired Secret Service operative, a man with a past far darker and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. When the bikers think they've won, Frank's skills and his connections come roaring back to life, setting off a chain of events that will bring their criminal empire to its knees. The bikers, led by the infamous gang boss, have no idea that they've just awakened a storm, and when Frank is done, they won't just be out of business, they'll be a forgotten memory. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. Frank had always been a man of routines. He woke up at 6 a.m. every morning, brewed his coffee with precision, and got into his cab by 7 a.m. sharp. His life was simple, predictable, and quiet. A far cry from the days when he wore a suit and carried a badge, protecting the country's elite from threats most people never saw. He had walked away from that life years ago, choosing instead the peaceful anonymity of a taxi driver. It was far from glamorous, but it was safe, it was calm, and for the most part it was easy. But that morning, as he cruised through the streets, something felt different. The usual hum of the city was louder, more chaotic. Maybe it was just the cold wind brushing against the windows, or maybe it was the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him today would not be like any other. The bikers appeared out of nowhere. Frank was stopped at a red light when they came roaring down the street. Loud engines rumbling in unison as if they owned the roads. They weaved in and out of traffic, drawing attention with their reckless moves. Frank's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. A group of them, easily 5 or 6 strong, were approaching, their bikes cutting through the crowd of cars with unbridled aggression. "Idiots," Frank muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He had seen enough of this kind of behavior during his years in service. People who felt invincible. People who didn't care about the consequences. The leader of the group, a large, burly man with a bandana covering his face, was the first to pull up beside Frank's cab. Frank could see him clearly now, his leather jacket adorned with patches and insignia that marked him as the head of some gang. The man revved his engine obnoxiously, leaning in toward the cab window with a grin that screamed trouble. "Hey taxi," the biker shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You got somewhere to be, or are you just sitting there wasting gas?" Frank didn't reply. He simply looked ahead, waiting for the light to change. He wasn't in the mood for confrontation. He had seen enough violence in his life, had been part of enough violent situations, to know when to walk away. But the biker wasn't done. He revved his engine again, louder this time, causing Frank's cab to shake from the vibrations. The other bikers were closing in around him now, circling his cab like sharks, their eyes locked on him through the glass. "Come on, old man," the biker taunted. "You deaf or something?" Frank sighed. He had hoped for a quiet morning, but it seemed the universe had other plans. He wasn't afraid. He hadn't been afraid of men like this when he wore a badge, and he wasn't afraid now. But he also knew that provoking them could lead to something worse. The best course of action was always to wait it out. The light finally changed, and Frank eased his foot off the brake, preparing to move forward. But just as he did, the burly biker swerved his bike in front of Frank's cab, blocking his path. The other bikers followed suit, positioning their motorcycles in such a way that Frank was now trapped in the middle of the street. "Get out of the way," Frank said, his voice firm as he rolled down the window just enough to be heard. The bikers were closing in, each of them clearly eager to escalate the situation. "Not so fast, old man," the leader sneered, his voice full of bravado. "We've got a little score to settle with you." Frank's fingers moved instinctively to the gear shift, his mind already assessing the situation. He didn't want to engage, but he wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him either. The bikers were looking for a fight, but Frank had learned long ago that in situations like these, patience and precision were key. The biker leader motioned to one of his men, who moved toward the back of the cab. Frank could hear the engine roar louder as they revved their bikes, the sound grating against his nerves. Then, without warning, the back of the cab was struck, the force sending a shockwave through Frank's body as the impact jolted him forward. Frank's heart rate spiked, but his movements were calm. He didn't have to think. His training kicked in immediately. The bikers were trying to provoke him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The leader laughed, pulling up beside the cab once more. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna cry to the cops? They don't care about you." Frank's eyes narrowed, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself a brief flash of anger. They had just smashed his cab. But this wasn't about the damage to the car. It was about principle. The light turned green again and Frank didn't hesitate. He slammed the gas pedal down and, with a swift turn of the wheel, maneuvered his cab forward with calculated precision. The burly biker tried to rev his engine and block the cab, but Frank had already anticipated the move. The front of Frank's cab clipped the biker's bike, sending it skidding across the pavement. The man was thrown off, landing in the street with a thud. Frank didn't slow down. He wasn't about to get caught in a fight, not when he could avoid it. The remaining bikers cursed and revved their engines, chasing after Frank's cab. But as they did, Frank's mind shifted gears. He wasn't just a taxi driver anymore. This wasn't just a random altercation. He was back in the game. And these bikers had no idea that they had just awakened the very skills they thought were long buried. Frank's hands were steady on the wheel as he sped through the city streets, weaving in and out of traffic. The bikers were close now, their engines roaring in his rearview mirror, and the familiar tension began to creep back into his muscles. His breathing was slow and even, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but his mind was already working, calculating the next move. The city was his old battleground and he knew it like the back of his hand. The bikers weren't giving up. They were closing in, their bikes cutting through traffic with reckless abandon. Frank's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the cab to its limits. He wasn't in a race. He wasn't trying to outrun them. He was buying time. Time to think, time to plan, and time to strike back. The road ahead opened up as Frank took a sharp turn, moving onto a side street. He wasn't expecting a getaway, he was expecting a fight. The bikers would be too determined to let him go that easily. They had provoked him and now they would see what that meant. What they didn't know was that Frank wasn't just a man behind the wheel. He was a man with a past that made him capable of more than just driving a cab. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The leader of the pack was still tailing him, the other bikers forming a tight formation behind him. Frank could see their faces now, eyes filled with anger, the promise of violence in every rev of their engines. But he didn't flinch. He'd faced worse. A lot worse. Frank's thoughts flashed back to the days when he wore the suit, the badge, and the weight of responsibility that came with it. He had been part of an elite unit, a Secret Service operative trained to handle threats with precision, to defuse dangerous situations with calm and control. He had served his country, put his life on the line, and survived more than a few close calls. But that life was over, or so he thought. When Frank retired, he left that world behind. He walked away from the intensity, the constant danger, and the life that had consumed him for so long. He had wanted peace, quiet, and a simple life driving a cab. It was supposed to be an escape. But it wasn't a full escape. Not by a long shot. The familiar weight of his old training began to surface. His mind sharpened as the sounds of the city filled his senses. The engine's roar, the screech of tires, and the distant hum of sirens all seemed to fade into the background as Frank's instincts took over. He had done this before. He had been in situations where lives were on the line, where everything depended on a split-second decision. He wasn't about to let some bikers mess with him without learning exactly what kind of man they had chosen to pick a fight with. He slammed the brakes, sending the cab into a sharp 180-degree turn, just as the bikers neared. For a moment, the sound of screeching tires filled the air, and Frank could feel the jolt of the turn, the G-force pressing him against the seat. But it wasn't about the turn. It was about the next move. The lead biker, caught off guard by the sudden maneuver, had no time to react as Frank threw the car into reverse, screeching backward into the street. The impact was swift. The back of Frank's cab collided with the lead biker's motorcycle, sending the rider tumbling to the ground in a tangled mess of leather and metal. The other bikers hesitated, momentarily stunned by the sight of their leader crashing to the pavement. That hesitation was all Frank needed. He slammed the car into drive and darted down an alley, cutting through the narrow passageway and forcing the bikers to give chase. They were fast, but they weren't fast enough to outmaneuver Frank. As he pushed the cab faster, the old adrenaline began to flow through his body. It was like flipping a switch. Frank wasn't just a man trying to survive. He was a man who had trained for moments like this. Moments when things went from simple to deadly in an instant. He was back in his element. The bikers were close now, but Frank was ready. He pulled a sharp right turn into another alleyway, clipping the edge of a dumpster just as the lead biker made his move. Frank didn't flinch. He slammed the brakes again, sending the bike flying off the road as it collided with a wall of brick. 2 down. 4 to go. Frank's pulse was steady now, his mind working methodically through the next steps. He wasn't just trying to escape. He was trying to teach these bikers a lesson. They had no idea who they were messing with. But they would learn. As the last of the bikers closed in, Frank was already preparing his next move. He could feel the eyes of the bikers on him, their rage palpable, their egos bruised. But that was their mistake. They had underestimated him. And now, Frank was going to show them exactly what happens when you push a man who had nothing left to lose. He hit the brakes hard once again, making the cab skid sideways. The tires screeched as Frank's hand flew to the gearshift. He shifted into reverse, but this time instead of trying to outrun them, he faced them head-on. The last biker, too focused on chasing him, didn't have time to react. Frank didn't wait. The moment the biker was within range, he shifted gears again, throwing the cab forward, ramming into the last motorcycle. The rider was thrown off the bike, slamming against the concrete with a sickening thud. Now there were only two. Frank knew the fight wasn't over. These men were part of a bigger picture, a network of criminals and corrupt bikers who ruled the streets. But Frank wasn't just going to walk away. Not this time. They had made a mistake, one that would cost them more than they ever realized. The engine of Frank's cab purred beneath him as he drove down the winding city streets, his hands steady on the wheel. The fight was far from over. He had taken down 3 of the bikers, but the remaining 2 were still hot on his tail. Frank didn't feel a sense of triumph though. This wasn't about winning a simple fight. It was about sending a message. A message that these bikers, and anyone else who thought they could dominate the city, needed to hear. He didn't know who the bikers worked for or who was pulling their strings, but he wasn't about to let them get away. They had attacked his cab, and in doing so they had made a grave mistake. Frank wasn't just some ordinary driver. He was a trained operative, and he wasn't about to let the criminal underworld go unchecked. As Frank swerved around a corner, the 2 remaining bikers followed suit, keeping their distance but gaining ground. They were faster than him, that much was clear. Their motorcycles roared behind him like a pair of hungry predators. But Frank wasn't worried. He had a plan. It was just a matter of executing it perfectly. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the bikers closing in. The leader was riding the second bike, a smaller, faster machine, while the last one, smaller and leaner, was directly behind him. Frank took a deep breath, his mind quickly working through his options. He didn't have a lot of time. But he wasn't going to let these 2 think they had the upper hand. Without warning, Frank jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the cab into a sharp, unexpected turn. The tires screamed in protest as the car skidded sideways, but Frank's instincts were razor sharp. He knew the streets and he knew how to navigate them with precision. The bikers, taken off guard by the sudden maneuver, tried to match his speed, but the corner was too tight. As Frank came around the bend, he slammed the brakes, causing the cab to fishtail slightly. The biker leader, riding behind him, was too close to the cab to react in time. The bike collided with the rear of the cab, sending the leader tumbling off his bike and crashing into the pavement. His helmet cracked on impact and he didn't move. Frank didn't slow down. He was already moving forward, the remaining biker now in his sights. But this wasn't going to be easy. The last biker wasn't foolish. He wasn't going to let Frank take him down so easily. Frank's mind raced as he pressed the accelerator, pushing the cab forward. The remaining biker gunned the engine, trying to keep pace, his eyes narrowed with determination. The 2 of them weaved through the streets at breakneck speed, their battle now a war of attrition. But Frank was calculating and the biker was reckless. Frank could feel his pulse steadying as he began to slow his breathing. He had been trained for moments like these, where every movement had to be deliberate. He was used to the high stakes, used to being the target. The bikers' aggression was their downfall. Frank knew how to outsmart them. He took a sharp left turn, narrowly avoiding a group of pedestrians. The biker, who had been gaining ground, followed too closely and wasn't ready for the sudden change of direction. His bike fishtailed out of control as he tried to turn too quickly, and Frank could see the biker's face twist in panic as he lost control. In a flash, the biker was thrown off his bike, skidding across the pavement before crashing into a dumpster. Frank didn't look back. The fight was over. The streets were quiet now, except for the distant sound of sirens. Frank slowed the cab, his heart still pounding from the chase. His grip on the wheel tightened as the adrenaline began to subside. The danger was over, for now. He had taken down the 2 bikers, but the bigger picture was still looming in the background. Who had sent them? And why? Frank wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He pulled the cab over to the side of the road, taking a moment to catch his breath. He could feel the tension in his muscles begin to loosen, but his mind was already racing ahead. The bikers had been a distraction, a mere foothold in a larger criminal empire. Whoever they worked for, whatever gang they were a part of, it didn't matter. Frank had faced down worse threats than a few street punks. He was in the middle of something much bigger now. As Frank sat in the cab, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows across his dashboard, he knew that the next step would take him deeper into the city's underworld. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced worse before, had walked through fire and come out the other side. He wasn't just a man who drove a cab anymore. He was someone with a past that was starting to catch up with him. He wasn't running from it anymore. This fight was his, and it was time to finish what had been started. Frank's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror one last time. He wasn't done with these streets yet. And the people who thought they could run the city? They were about to learn exactly who they were messing with. The sirens in the distance were getting closer, but Frank wasn't concerned. He had done this enough times to know that the police wouldn't get here in time to make a difference. His eyes flicked over to the fallen bikers, the ones who'd been foolish enough to pick a fight with him. The first one was still out cold, lying sprawled in the middle of the street, while the second was nursing a bruised shoulder and a torn leather jacket. Frank didn't take joy in their pain, but he knew better than to feel sorry for them. They were a symptom of a much larger problem, one that he was about to make his own. As Frank threw the gearshift into drive, the engine rumbled to life, and the tires squealed against the asphalt as he pulled away. He was in no rush to leave though. He wasn't running from the bikers, or the police for that matter. Frank knew the city too well. And more importantly, he knew the people who ruled it from the shadows. He knew the criminal networks that lurked beneath the surface, waiting for their next opportunity. The bikers weren't just out for a joyride. They were a message, a warning. And Frank wasn't one to ignore messages. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that these bikers were just pawns in a much larger game. They were trying to intimidate him, scare him off, force him into submission. But Frank wasn't the type to be intimidated. Not anymore. He kept the cab moving, heading toward the outskirts of the city. His mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of information he had. The bikers had a name, a reputation, a criminal syndicate that controlled a large part of the city's underground activities. Frank had crossed paths with them before. They were ruthless and they had deep ties to both the law and the underworld. But Frank wasn't afraid of them. Not anymore. He had worked for years as a Secret Service operative, guarding the country's most important officials, fighting terrorists, and dismantling criminal networks far more dangerous than a few street thugs. But when the time came to retire, Frank had chosen peace. He'd chosen the simple life of a taxi driver. He'd wanted out. But life had a funny way of dragging him back in. He flicked the radio dial to a local station, filling the cab with the low hum of jazz music. It was his usual habit. A little distraction from the dark thoughts that crept into his mind. But even as the soft notes filled the air, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. The bikers weren't just part of a gang, they were part of something bigger. Something far more dangerous. Frank wasn't just a former agent anymore. He was a target. And the people who were targeting him were starting to make their move. Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He reached over and pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text message from an old contact, someone from his days in the service. He clicked it open. "You've been noticed. Keep your head down. They know who you are. You're in their sights now." The message was brief, but it sent a chill down Frank's spine. He'd known it was only a matter of time. The bikers had been a warning, but they weren't the ones pulling the strings. Frank had a feeling that the people behind this, whoever they were much closer to him than he realized. He tapped his fingers against the wheel, thinking. He could feel the weight of his past catching up with him, the shadows he thought he had outrun finally closing in. The last thing he wanted to do was dig into this deeper, but he knew he didn't have a choice. If these bikers were part of a larger criminal empire, then it was time for Frank to bring it down. He wasn't going to be anyone's pawn again. Frank glanced at the city skyline in the distance, his thoughts already on the next steps. He needed to find out who was behind this, who had put the bikers up to it. He didn't know who he was dealing with yet, but he was going to find out. The key to this puzzle lay somewhere in the streets, somewhere among the criminals, the corrupt officials, and the ones who thought they could hide behind layers of power and wealth. He couldn't do it alone. Frank needed information, and he knew exactly where to get it. As he turned a corner, the streets grew quieter, and the hustle of the city seemed to fade. Frank pulled into a small, dimly lit parking lot, hidden away behind a row of rundown buildings. This was the place, the one he had frequented before back in the day. A small bar where the city's lowlifes gathered to drink, talk, and forget about their problems. It wasn't much, but it was a place Frank knew he could get answers. He parked the cab and stepped out, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He walked toward the entrance of the bar, his boots clicking against the concrete. The neon sign flickered above him, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. He didn't need to look back to know that the bikers were still out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching. The bar smelled of stale beer and cigarettes as Frank stepped inside. The usual crowd was there, men in leather jackets, women with hard eyes and rough voices. They didn't pay Frank much attention though. They didn't care about the quiet man in the corner. But Frank wasn't just here for a drink. He was here for information. And he knew exactly who to talk to. At the far end of the bar sat an older man, hunched over a glass of whiskey, his face obscured by a scruffy beard and a weathered hat. Frank knew him well. His name was Benny, a former informant who had worked with Frank back in his agent days. Benny was the kind of man who knew everything that went on in the streets, the deals, the power struggles, and the names of the people who controlled it all. If anyone knew who was behind the bikers, it was Benny. Frank approached the bar, leaning in slightly. "Benny," he said quietly. The old man looked up, his eyes sharp despite the years. He gave a small nod, acknowledging Frank's presence. "Didn't expect to see you here, Frank. Thought you'd given up the game." Frank's lips tightened. "I'm not here for a drink. I need information." Benny raised an eyebrow, then gestured for Frank to sit down. "You're in deeper than you think, my friend. But I know you don't come here for nothing." Frank sat, leaning in as Benny lowered his voice. "What do you need to know?" The noise of the bar faded into the background as Frank leaned in closer to Benny, his eyes scanning the room. The faint glow of the neon lights and the low murmur of the patrons created a sense of isolation, as if they were the only two people in the world. Frank's focus was sharp, his mind calculating, working through the pieces of the puzzle he was slowly assembling. Benny, though a grizzled old man now, had once been a trusted informant, a man who knew the city's underbelly better than most. Frank had worked with him before, tracking down dangerous individuals, and Benny had always come through with useful information. Frank wasn't sure if Benny still had the same contacts, but he hoped his old friend would be able to help. "You've got to tell me who's behind these bikers, Benny," Frank said quietly. "I've got a feeling they're just the tip of the iceberg. They've got connections and I need to know where they lead." Benny took a long pull from his whiskey glass, his eyes narrowing as he looked Frank over. He'd been in this game long enough to know when a man was serious. And Frank? Frank was deadly serious. "You're walking into something bigger than you know, Frank," Benny muttered, setting his glass down with a soft clink. "These bikers? They're just hired muscle. They don't even know who they're working for. But the people who run this town, people like them, they don't mess around." Frank's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Benny was getting to the heart of it. Frank knew there was a bigger force at play here. It was never just about one small group of bikers. The people behind them, Benny continued, his voice low, they're connected. Big names. Bigger than you'd expect. They've been operating under the radar for years, pulling strings, buying off officials. This city's theirs. And it goes all the way to the top. Frank didn't blink. He was used to hearing these kinds of things. He had worked in the shadows of power before, infiltrating organizations and dismantling threats, but this felt different. The stakes were higher. And Benny was right, it was bigger than just some biker gang. "I need names, Benny," Frank said, his voice harder now. "I need to know who's really behind all this. Who's pulling the strings?" Benny looked over his shoulder nervously before leaning in closer. His voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper. "All right. But you didn't hear this from me, Frank. You go digging into this, you're gonna open up a can of worms you can't close. You might be digging your own grave." Frank wasn't deterred. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. "I'm not afraid. Just give me what you've got." Benny hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the risks. Finally, he sighed, his weathered face softening with the kind of regret that only comes from years of living in the shadows. "All right," Benny said, his voice barely audible. "The bikers, they work for a guy named Vincent McCall. But McCall's not just some street thug. He's a part of a larger syndicate, a criminal empire that's embedded itself in every part of this city. Real estate, politics, even the cops. McCall's the face, the enforcer. But he's got a backer, a man who's pulling the strings. A man who's untouchable." Frank's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. McCall. The name was familiar. Frank had heard whispers about him in the past. A shadowy figure involved in the worst parts of the city's criminal underworld. But hearing it confirmed by Benny made it real. McCall wasn't just a name anymore. He was the link in the chain, the figurehead of an empire. "And who's this backer?" Frank pressed. Benny shook his head slowly. "You don't want to know, Frank. It's not just about McCall. It's bigger than him." "The man backing McCall?" His name's Daniel Pierce. He's a businessman, a philanthropist. He's got his fingers in every pie in this city. But he's a snake, Frank. A snake who can't be touched. You try to get close to him and you won't just have McCall and his boys to worry about. You'll be going up against the city itself. Frank felt the weight of Benny's words sink in. Daniel Pierce. The name rang a bell, but it was hard to place. He had heard it in passing, connected to a few charity events, a few political fundraisers. But no one had ever dared to speak too much about him. Frank had a feeling there was a reason for that. Pierce wasn't just a businessman. He was the mastermind behind everything that was wrong in this city. So McCall works for Pierce, Frank said slowly. But Pierce is the real power behind all of this. Why the secrecy? Why keep it hidden? Benny leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Because Pierce doesn't need the publicity. He doesn't want to be caught. The people in this city, the ones who are supposed to protect it, they're in his pocket. The cops, the politicians, even some of the judges, they all owe him. And if they don't, they get paid off. Or worse. Pierce is like a puppet master, Frank. He pulls the strings and everyone dances to his tune. Frank's mind was spinning. This wasn't just about a few crooked bikers. This was about a man who controlled the entire city's fate. Pierce was the key to everything, and taking him down was the only way to dismantle the empire. Frank's years in the Secret Service had prepared him for moments like this. Moments when everything depended on one decision, one move that could change everything. I need to find him, Frank said, his voice steely. And I need to bring him down. Benny shook his head, a grim smile on his face. You're asking the impossible, Frank. Pierce is untouchable. You'll need more than guts to get to him. But I can point you in the right direction. You're going to need to go deep into his network, infiltrate his circle. And that means you'll need help. Frank's gaze locked with Benny's. I've done this before. I can do it again. Frank felt the weight of Benny's words hanging in the air as the two of them sat in the dimly lit bar. The task ahead wasn't just dangerous, it was nearly impossible. Daniel Pierce had built an empire so entrenched in the city's power structure that Frank was going to need every ounce of his old training to even make a dent. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about tearing down the whole system Pierce had built, brick by brick. Benny's information had been invaluable, but it was only the start. Frank knew that to get to Pierce he was going to need to go deeper, to infiltrate the network in a way that would leave no trace. The man behind the bikers, the one who had orchestrated the attack on Frank's cab, was just a small part of a much bigger picture. We'll need to start small, Frank said, his voice low and controlled. Pierce has people everywhere. But he doesn't control everything. There are cracks. And I'll find them. Benny nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told Frank the old informant wasn't as sure as he seemed. You've got guts, Frank. But you're going up against an empire. And when you start digging into that, people get hurt. You know that better than anyone. Frank leaned back in his chair, his eyes hardening. I know. But I can't sit back and let him run this city. Pierce is a cancer, and if I don't do something, it's going to spread until there's nothing left. Benny took another long drink, the amber liquid swirling in his glass as he thought it over. Then he placed it down slowly, his voice quieter. You'll need more than just information, Frank. You'll need help. I don't think you can take Pierce down on your own. He's too connected. Frank's mind raced, but he didn't immediately respond. He had worked alone for years. He was used to being the one who carried the weight of every operation on his shoulders. But Benny was right. This was a different kind of fight. The reach of Pierce's network was too vast, too entrenched for a lone wolf to bring it down. Frank needed allies. Who do you have in mind? Frank asked. Benny didn't hesitate. I know a few people, but they won't trust you right away. You'll need to prove yourself. If you want in, you'll need to show you can handle the heat. I'll make a few calls, see if anyone's willing to help. But you'll have to earn their loyalty. Frank gave him a tight nod. He had earned the trust of plenty of people in the past. If he had to work his way back into the good graces of some old contacts, so be it. He wasn't going to waste time. He had a city to save. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings in dimly lit back rooms, and hours spent in the shadows of the city's darkest corners. Frank didn't have the luxury of waiting around. The longer he let Pierce's empire go unchecked, the more power Pierce gained. Frank knew that once he started his assault, there would be no going back. Benny had come through. He had reached out to a few old contacts, former law enforcement, people who had once walked in the same circles as Frank. They were hesitant at first, unsure about the old agent who had disappeared into retirement. But Frank didn't waste time with small talk. He got straight to the point. He was here for Pierce and he needed help. As Frank sat across from a man named Jack Donovan, an ex-cop turned private investigator, he knew this was his best chance. Donovan had connections to some of the city's biggest movers and shakers, and his knowledge of Pierce's operations was more extensive than Frank had hoped. "All right, Frank," Donovan said, lighting a cigarette as he leaned back in his chair. "You're asking for a lot. Pierce isn't just some crooked businessman. He's a damn ghost. He's got people everywhere and no one talks about him. Ever. You're sure you want to go down this road?" Frank's gaze was steady. "I don't have a choice." Donovan took a long drag, staring at Frank. "Fine. I'll help you. But you need to know something. You'll be up against more than just bikers and dirty politicians. Pierce doesn't just have power. He has influence. He's got the kind of control over the city that you don't see. So before you go poking around, make sure you're ready for the fallout. You start messing with his people and you might as well put a target on your back." Frank didn't blink. He had been through worse. Much worse. "I've been through hell before. This won't be any different." Donovan smirked, clearly skeptical, but he seemed to respect Frank's resolve. "All right. First things first, you'll need to find a way into Pierce's circle. And that means getting close to his associates. People who move in his inner circles. I'll see what I can dig up, but you need to move fast. Pierce isn't going to sit idly by while you try to take him down." Frank leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "I'll take care of the rest. Just get me the names." Donovan gave a curt nod. "I'll see what I can do. But Frank, you make one wrong move and it's over. You're not just going up against bikers anymore. You're going up against the city itself." Frank stood up, his face a mask of determination. "I'm ready." Back in the streets, Frank knew the fight had only just begun. But he wasn't just a man seeking revenge. He was seeking justice, and he wasn't going to stop until Pierce's empire was nothing more than dust and broken dreams. The pieces were falling into place, and Frank had already decided there would be no turning back. As he drove through the night, his mind raced with plans, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. He had to take down Pierce, but he had to be smart about it. He couldn't rush. He needed to gather the right people, infiltrate the right circles, and strike when the time was right. Frank wasn't afraid. He had survived the worst. And now he was going to make sure that Pierce's empire crumbled, starting with the bikers who had made the mistake of crossing his path. Frank drove through the empty streets, the neon lights casting eerie shadows across the pavement as his mind continued to race. The city was alive, but there was a stillness in the air, a quiet before the storm. He had taken the first steps toward dismantling Pierce's empire, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The wheels were in motion, but there was no guarantee of success. Frank had faced down plenty of enemies in his time, but this felt different. There was something about Pierce, something dark, something elusive, that made Frank's blood run cold. As Frank turned a corner and passed an alleyway, a figure stepped out from the shadows, catching his attention. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but he relaxed when he saw who it was. "Benny, what are you doing here?" Frank asked, his voice low. Benny glanced around before stepping closer to the cab, his face grim. "You weren't the only one looking for answers, Frank," Benny replied, his voice quiet but urgent. "I did some digging. Found something you're going to want to hear." Frank's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Benny glanced back down the alley to make sure they weren't being watched before stepping closer to the car. "You've got to be careful, Frank. Pierce isn't just running a criminal operation. He's got friends in high places. People who are untouchable. I know this guy, Detective Harris. He's dirty but not in the way you might think. Harris is in bed with Pierce. If you're going after him, you might want to start there." Frank's stomach tightened. He had suspected Pierce's influence ran deep, but this was something else. A corrupt cop? That was a problem. Harris wasn't just another low-level thug, he was a part of the system itself. Frank had been a part of that system once. He knew how dangerous it could be when the very people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who posed the greatest threat. "I'll take care of Harris," Frank said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure he talks." "Thanks, Benny." Benny nodded but hesitated. "Just remember, Frank, people like Harris don't give up information easily. And when you push them, they don't play by the rules. You might be walking into a trap. I've been around long enough to know how these things go. You should watch your back." Frank didn't respond right away. He didn't need Benny to remind him of the dangers. Frank had been in the game long enough to know the risks. He wasn't naive. But Benny was right about one thing. This was about more than just taking down Pierce's thugs. It was about peeling back the layers of corruption and taking down everyone in Pierce's pocket. And that included Harris. Frank pulled away from the curb, his eyes focused on the road ahead. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, but his mind was already working through his plan. Harris would be tough to crack, but Frank had experience. He could play the game. He had done it before. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows. Frank's thoughts were clear now, his focus sharp. He didn't know exactly how Pierce's web would unwind, but he knew one thing for sure. It started with Harris. It wasn't long before Frank arrived at the address Benny had given him. A small, unmarked building tucked away in a corner of the city. It looked harmless enough, just another one of the countless abandoned warehouses that dotted the urban landscape. But Frank knew better. This wasn't some random location. This was where the corruption was cultivated. Where people like Harris met with those who held the strings. Frank parked the cab at the corner of the street out of sight. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he didn't plan on walking away empty-handed. He had to be quick, precise. He couldn't afford any slip-ups. The longer Harris stayed quiet, the more dangerous Pierce became. He approached the building cautiously, his steps quiet but purposeful. The shadows seemed to grow longer, more ominous, as Frank neared the entrance. He reached for his phone and sent a quick message to Benny. "I'm in position. I'll make it quick." As Frank stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and rust filled his nose. The building was eerily silent, and Frank's eyes darted around as he moved deeper into the structure. He had been in situations like this before, lone operations where everything hinged on taking the right steps at the right time. But something about this place didn't feel right. It was too quiet. Frank's heart rate quickened as he heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. He quickly found cover behind a stack of wooden crates, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. The shadows seemed to press in on him from all sides as the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder. He waited, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just short of his hiding spot, and Frank held his breath, knowing he couldn't afford to make a sound. His eyes flicked toward the entrance, where a dim light now illuminated the silhouette of a man, Detective Harris. Frank's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. He needed to hear what Harris had to say. He needed to know how deep the rabbit hole went. Harris spoke into the silence. "I know you're out there, Frank. You're not the only one who can play this game." Frank stepped out from behind the crates, his eyes locked on Harris. "I'm not here to play games," Frank said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here for answers." Harris chuckled darkly, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "You think I'm going to just give them to you? You think you can walk in here and start making demands? You have no idea who you're up against?" Frank didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm up against. And I'm not leaving until you talk." Harris's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You think Pierce is your problem? You've only seen the tip of the iceberg. You're in way over your head, Frank. But if you want answers, I'll give them to you. But don't expect them to come easy." Frank's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here for easy. Now talk." Harris stood still, his hands resting on his hips, his expression hardening as Frank took a step closer. The dim light from the cracked windows flickered above them, casting sharp shadows over Harris's face. For a moment, Frank felt the weight of the situation press in on him. This was it, the moment where everything could shift, where the scales could tip in either direction. Harris was the key to unlocking Pierce's empire, and Frank wasn't going to let him walk away. Frank's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, but his voice remained calm. "Talk, Harris. I'm done asking." Harris met Frank's gaze, his eyes narrowing. There was no fear in the detective's face, just a cold, calculating look that spoke of years of corruption, of playing a game that had long since lost any moral boundaries. Frank knew that Harris wasn't a man who would break easily. But he also knew that everyone had a breaking point, and he was about to find Harris's. "You really don't get it, do you, Frank?" Harris said, his voice low, almost taunting. "You think you can just waltz in here and take down Pierce? You're a ghost now, a relic of a life you left behind. But you're not in that world anymore. You've got no leverage, no backup. You're nothing." Frank didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. He knew exactly who he was. A man who had lived in the shadows for years, a man who had sacrificed everything for the job, and now, a man who had nothing left to lose. He wasn't the man who had once worn a suit and a badge, guarding politicians and heads of state. He wasn't the man who had been part of a team that protected the country's highest officials. That life was over. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the here and now. What mattered was taking down the man who had poisoned the city from the inside out. "I didn't come here to get lectures from you, Harris," Frank said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I came here for answers. And you're going to give them to me?" Harris's smile was cold, his eyes flickering with something darker. "Fine. You want answers? I'll give them to you. But just know, once you go down this path you won't be able to turn back. Pierce is everywhere, Frank. He owns this city, every corner, every alley. He's got cops, politicians, even judges in his pocket. If you try to take him down you'll be marked. And it won't just be Pierce coming after you. Everyone who works for him will, too. You think you're the only one who can make a move? Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool. Harris was trying to get under his skin, trying to make him doubt himself. But Frank wasn't here to play games. He was here to find out what made the wheels of Pierce's empire turn. He needed Harris to talk. And he needed him to talk fast. I'm not afraid of Pierce, Frank said. And I'm not afraid of you. I'll burn the whole damn city down if that's what it takes to bring him down. Harris chuckled darkly, the sound grating against Frank's nerves. You really think you can take down someone like Pierce? You're a damn fool. He's got people watching every move you make. You don't even know what you're up against. Frank took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Tell me about the network. Tell me how Pierce is running everything. And don't lie to me. I know about the bikers. I know you've got your hands in everything. So you better start talking. Harris seemed to hesitate for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously to the door as if weighing his options. Frank could see it in his face. The detective knew this was a turning point. If he didn't give Frank what he needed, things were going to get ugly. The life he had built with Pierce, this entire city of corruption, was crumbling. And Harris was right in the middle of it. Harris finally let out a long, slow breath, as if he had come to a decision. All right. You want the truth, Frank? Pierce is more than just a criminal. He's not some small-time thug who deals in drugs and stolen goods. He's running the city. The entire operation, the drugs, the money laundering, the human trafficking, all of it. It's like a spider's web and Pierce is at the center of it. Frank's gaze never left Harris's face. How does it all work? Harris leaned in, lowering his voice even further. McCall's just a front. He's the muscle, the enforcer. The bikers, the dealers, they're all part of Pierce's plan. But Pierce doesn't just control the streets. He controls the flow of information. He's got spies everywhere, and he uses them to manipulate the city's most powerful people. He's got people on the inside, cops, lawyers, businessmen, everyone who matters. And they all answer to him. Frank absorbed the information, his mind working quickly. Harris was spilling the truth, but Frank wasn't convinced. There was more. There had to be more. If Pierce's reach was as far as Harris was saying, then getting to him wouldn't be easy. But Frank wasn't about to stop. He was already too deep. What's his next move? Frank asked, his voice steady. What's he planning? Harris looked around nervously again, his hands fidgeting. That's the part you don't want to know. Pierce has been planning something big. He's setting up something that'll give him control over the entire city. Something that'll make him untouchable. I don't know all the details, but I know it's happening soon. He's got connections with some high-ranking officials. Officials who are too powerful for anyone to go after. If you try to stop him now, you'll be putting a target on your back. No one can touch him. Frank's blood ran cold. It was worse than he had feared. Pierce wasn't just running a criminal operation. He was planning to solidify his power, to make himself untouchable. And if Frank didn't act fast, it would be too late. I'm not backing down, Frank said, his voice low and dangerous. I'll take Pierce down no matter what it takes. Harris smirked, but there was fear in his eyes now. You're a dead man, Frank. But if you want to go after him, you'd better start preparing. Because once you make a move, there's no turning back. Frank stepped closer, his face hardening. Then it's a good thing I've never been afraid of what's coming. Frank's eyes never left Harris as the words hung in the air between them. The detective's expression was a mixture of fear and resignation. Frank had expected some resistance, but Harris had already started to crack. The knowledge of what was coming next, of what Pierce was planning, was enough to make anyone nervous. Frank had learned that the hard way. It wasn't just the men you could see who were dangerous. It was the ones who controlled everything from behind closed doors that posed the real threat. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching at his side. Frank knew that the detective wasn't going to last much longer. The truth was slipping from him like water through his fingers, and it wasn't long before Frank would have everything he needed. But it wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just a manhunt. This was about tearing down an empire piece by piece, and that meant digging deeper than ever before. You've given me a lot, Harris, Frank said, his voice low and steady. But I need more. I need to know exactly where this all leads. Where is Pierce going to make his move? Harris swallowed hard, his throat working as if the words were stuck. I don't know everything, he muttered, almost pleading. I'm just a cog in the machine. I don't get the whole picture. But there's a meeting, a big one, coming up. It's happening tomorrow night. I don't know the details, but I've seen the names. Powerful people. Cops, city officials, businessmen. The kind of people who can make anything happen. Pierce is going to use that meeting to solidify his control over the city. He's going to make sure no one can touch him. Frank felt his blood run cold. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The culmination of everything Pierce had been building. If Frank didn't act now, Pierce would make his final play. Frank couldn't allow that. He had spent too many years protecting people, keeping them safe, only to let this man, the one who controlled everything in the shadows, slip through his fingers. Where is this meeting? Frank asked, his voice sharp. I don't know the exact location, Harris answered, his voice trembling now. But I know it's being held at one of Pierce's private properties. A place he's been using to meet with his inner circle. You'll never find it unless you have someone on the inside. And if you do get inside, don't expect to make it out alive. Frank was already on the move. He didn't have time for games. I'll find it, he said. I've been doing this long enough to know how to get in and out undetected. Harris nodded as if resigned to his fate. He knew Frank was right. You're not going to win, Frank. Even if you make it to the meeting, even if you confront Pierce, it's all over. You've already signed your death warrant by going after him. Frank stood tall, unshaken by the threat. I've been dead before, Harris. This isn't about survival. This is about making sure he doesn't destroy everything. As Frank made his way toward the exit of the warehouse, he could feel the tension building. Tomorrow night was the night. The final showdown. And everything would hinge on what happened then. He had one shot, one chance to take down Pierce's empire. Frank wasn't going to waste it. The following day was a blur of preparations. Frank spent the daylight hours gathering information, contacting his remaining allies, and preparing for what was sure to be a deadly confrontation. Benny had come through with a few more names, people who knew the ins and outs of Pierce's operations, and Frank had spent hours going through old contacts, trying to find someone who could get him inside. He didn't trust many, but a few old faces still had the connections Frank needed to slip into the belly of the beast. As dusk settled over the city, Frank found himself sitting in the driver's seat of his cab again. It was familiar, comfortable even, but the weight of the night ahead pressed heavily on him. He wasn't just driving anymore. He was hunting. And the prey he was after was the most dangerous thing this city had ever known. He couldn't afford to fail. Not tonight. The cab was parked on a side street, hidden from the main roads, just a few blocks from the location he had gathered from his sources. Benny's intel had led him to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city, a place that was known to be one of Pierce's hideouts. Frank knew that if he was going to get close enough to Pierce to end this once and for all, this was his chance. But Frank wasn't naive. He knew the risks. He knew that the people inside this mansion wouldn't hesitate to kill him if they saw him coming. Pierce's empire had its claws deep in this city, and tonight Frank was walking into the heart of it. Frank stepped out of the cab, his coat pulled tight against the chill of the evening. His heart rate was steady, his focus sharp. Every step he took felt like it was leading him deeper into enemy territory. But he didn't hesitate. He had already made his peace with what had to be done. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered under Pierce's reign of control. It was about bringing down the man who had poisoned the city from the inside out. The mansion loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Frank knew the entrance was heavily guarded, but that didn't matter. He had trained for situations like this. He had taken down enemies in places far worse than this. And tonight Pierce would fall. As Frank approached the gates, he paused for a moment, surveying the perimeter. There were guards, at least 3 that he could see. They were stationed at the front, keeping a watchful eye on the mansion's grounds. Frank's eyes darted between them, calculating their movements. He had to act quickly before anyone realized he was there. With one final breath, Frank slipped into the shadows, his footsteps barely audible as he made his way toward the entrance. The cold air was thick with tension as Frank moved silently through the shadows, inching closer to the mansion's gated entrance. His instincts were sharp, his every movement deliberate. He wasn't going to waste time, not when he was this close to the heart of the beast. Pierce's empire was within reach, and Frank was ready to tear it down piece by piece. He had studied the mansion's layout earlier, mentally mapping out the quickest route inside. The mansion was large, sprawling over several acres, but Frank knew that the real key to this operation was getting past the guards unnoticed. He couldn't afford to take on a small army of armed men. He had to be precise, stealthy, and fast. Frank paused behind a large stone pillar, his eyes scanning the grounds. The guards were still at their posts, chatting briefly before continuing their rounds. Frank waited patiently, watching, his mind calculating the best time to move. He had been in situations like this before, sneaking into heavily guarded compounds, infiltrating places no one was supposed to be. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything depended on his ability to stay undetected. As one of the guards turned his back, Frank made his move. He crouched low, slipping past the first perimeter, avoiding the spotlight from the security cameras overhead. His movements were fluid, his training kicking in. Frank had spent years learning how to blend into the shadows, how to move without leaving a trace. The years of service had honed him into the perfect operative, and now that training was his greatest weapon. The gates were just ahead. Frank reached for his lockpicks, fingers working quickly as he knelt in front of the heavy wrought iron gate. He knew the alarm system was top-notch, but he'd seen enough security measures in his day to know that a well-placed tool could bypass anything they had set up. After a few seconds, he heard the satisfying click as the lock released. He was inside. Frank stepped into the mansion's expansive grounds, his eyes darting from window to window, looking for signs of movement. The mansion itself stood in front of him, dark and imposing, a symbol of Pierce's power. This place was the heart of the criminal empire Frank had sworn to dismantle. But the real challenge lay ahead, Pierce. Frank knew he wasn't just walking into a building. He was walking into the lion's den. He moved quickly, staying low as he approached the mansion's back door. There were fewer guards here, which suited Frank just fine. As he reached for the door handle, his heart rate remained steady. He was in the lion's den now, and there would be no turning back once he stepped inside. The door creaked open just enough for Frank to slip through, and he was met with darkness. The air inside the mansion was thick with the smell of old wood, polished furniture, and something more sinister, a sense of control. The walls seemed to close in on him as he made his way through the hallways, his senses on high alert. The entire mansion felt like a labyrinth, twisting and turning in on itself. But Frank knew one thing for sure. He wasn't here to play games. He was here to take down Daniel Pierce. As he moved deeper into the mansion, the sound of voices reached his ears. Frank froze, listening intently. The voices were muffled, but he could hear the faint murmur of conversation. He was close. Frank's eyes flicked to the door ahead. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack he could see the faint glow of light. He moved quickly, silently, his feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floors. The voices grew louder as he approached. He had to be careful. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. He positioned himself just outside the door, pressing his ear to the wood. What he heard next made his blood run cold. "Pierce isn't happy," one of the voices said, the tone laced with concern. "The operation's not going as planned. McCall's men are losing ground, and if we don't move quickly, it's all going to fall apart." Frank's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice. It was one of Pierce's top men. He had been on Frank's radar for months. The conversation was about more than just some small-time operation. This was bigger, much bigger. Pierce's empire was on the verge of something catastrophic, and Frank was right in the middle of it. "McCall's gone," another voice responded, a tone of frustration in their words. "That's why we need to move now. If we don't take control, the entire city will be on fire by morning." Frank's mind raced. McCall's downfall was just the beginning. Pierce was planning something massive, something that could reshape the city forever. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. If he didn't stop this now, it would be too late. He pushed open the door just a crack, peeking inside. The room was dimly lit, but Frank could see a few figures gathered around a large table, papers and blueprints spread out in front of them. Pierce wasn't there, but Frank knew he was close. His men were making plans, preparing for something big. Something that would change everything. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back, retreating into the shadows. He had to be quick. Pierce had to be close. He couldn't waste any more time. With one last glance at the room, Frank made his move, slipping down the hallway toward the grand staircase. He was getting closer. The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, winding staircases and long hallways leading deeper into the heart of the operation. Every step he took was one step closer to the final showdown. The final fight to take down Pierce and end the reign of terror that had gripped the city for far too long. But Frank knew he wasn't alone anymore. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. Frank's pulse quickened as the footsteps behind him grew louder, closer. He didn't turn around. His senses were razor-sharp, and every instinct told him to keep moving forward. Whoever it was, they were getting closer, and Frank didn't have the luxury of getting caught. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. His hand slipped to his sidearm as he moved down the dark corridor, his eyes flicking back and forth, searching for cover. The footsteps were deliberate now, slower but still coming, and Frank's mind raced. Had they spotted him? Had someone noticed his presence inside the mansion? He couldn't afford to let himself get cornered. As the hallway stretched on, Frank's mind ran through his options. There was a window at the end of the corridor, an escape route if he could get to it in time. But with the sounds of footsteps growing louder, he knew his time was running out. The element of surprise was no longer in his favor. He reached the window, but before he could make his move, the door at the far end of the hallway creaked open. Frank didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, taking cover behind an old wooden cabinet. His heart pounded in his chest, every muscle tense, every sense focused. He had been in tight spots before, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just about taking down one criminal. This was about taking down a system, an empire built on fear and power. The footsteps drew closer, and Frank could hear the quiet murmur of voices, barely audible but growing in intensity. Whoever was in the hallway wasn't alone. It was a group. Frank's fingers tightened around his gun. He didn't need to see them to know that they were dangerous. And he didn't need to confront them just yet. He waited in the shadows, watching as figures passed by the door, their conversation growing louder. Frank's eyes narrowed as he recognized one of the voices. "Pierce wants results," one of the men said, his tone urgent. "We can't afford any more mistakes. McCall's gone, but that doesn't mean we're in the clear. We need to make sure the meeting tomorrow goes off without a hitch." Frank's muscles tensed. He knew that the meeting was the key. It wasn't just a criminal operation, it was Pierce's final play, the culmination of everything he had worked for. And Frank couldn't let it happen. As the voices faded into the distance, Frank slowly and quietly eased himself out from behind cover. He wasn't sure how many men were inside the mansion, but he knew that taking them out one by one wasn't an option. He had to get to Pierce. He had to stop the meeting before it began. The plan was simple: find Pierce, bring him down, and dismantle the empire in the process. Frank continued down the hallway, his footsteps almost silent as he moved with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His gun was at the ready, but he didn't draw it just yet. He had to get closer to the heart of the mansion. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. He could feel it. Every step was leading him closer to the storm. He reached the grand staircase and took a deep breath. The sounds from the lower levels were distant now, but he could still feel the weight of the danger pressing in from every direction. The mansion had become a maze of uncertainty, and Frank wasn't sure who was friend or foe anymore. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. As he reached the top of the stairs, Frank paused. The hallway in front of him was lined with doors, some closed, others ajar, each one a potential obstacle or ally. He didn't have time to search every room. He had to find Pierce's office, and fast. The last door on the left stood out to Frank. It was slightly cracked open, and Frank could feel the presence of someone inside. His instincts told him this was it. This was where it all came together. He approached the door slowly, his fingers ready to turn the handle. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew this was the moment. The moment when everything would change. And then, as if on cue, the door swung open, and Frank found himself face to face with the man he had been hunting. Daniel Pierce. The man who had manipulated and corrupted everything in this city stood before him, looking every bit the polished businessman he portrayed himself to be. But Frank knew better. The man in front of him wasn't just a businessman, he was a criminal mastermind, a puppeteer who had used his wealth and influence to control the city's darkest secrets. Pierce's eyes locked onto Frank's, and for a brief moment there was silence. The two men stood there, sizing each other up, neither one willing to make the first move. "Frank," Pierce said, his voice smooth, almost welcoming. "I've been expecting you." Frank didn't flinch. "I'm here to end this, Pierce. Your empire ends tonight." Pierce's smile never wavered. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're too late. The meeting tomorrow will solidify my control over this city. There's no going back now." Frank took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Pierce's. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Pierce's smile faltered for the first time, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You're nothing but a relic of a life you gave up, Frank. You have no power here." Frank's voice was steady as he replied, "I'm not walking away this time, Pierce. And I'm not alone. Your empire's crumbling?" Before Pierce could respond, Frank lunged forward, his hand grabbing the collar of Pierce's expensive suit and slamming him against the wall. "This ends now," Frank growled. The lights above them flickered. And for the first time, Frank saw fear in Pierce's eyes. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Frank's grip tightened around Pierce's collar as he slammed the businessman-turned-criminal into the wall. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the tension between the two men intensified. Pierce, the mastermind behind the city's corruption, the architect of its criminal underworld, was finally in Frank's grasp. But Frank knew better than to think this was over. This was just the beginning. Pierce's eyes flickered with something, a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. He was used to controlling people, manipulating them from the shadows. But now, for the first time, he was the one being controlled. And Frank wasn't about to let him slip away. "You think you can intimidate me, Frank?" Pierce spat, trying to regain his composure, his voice full of arrogance. "You've been out of the game too long. You don't know what you're dealing with." Frank's face was inches from Pierce's, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years of frustration. "I'm dealing with you. And I'm going to make sure you answer for everything you've done." Pierce let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're too late. The city's already in my hands. Tomorrow's meeting? It's the final step. Once I have control, no one will be able to stop me." Frank's jaw clenched. "That's what you think. But you're not invincible, Pierce. You made the mistake of underestimating me." Frank pushed Pierce back, but Pierce stumbled just slightly, his composure slipping for the first time. Frank knew that the man was crumbling inside just a little bit. The power that he had wielded for so long was slipping through his fingers. It wasn't over yet, but Frank was getting closer to the truth, closer to ending this nightmare once and for all. "I don't care about your plans," Frank said, stepping back, his eyes still fixed on Pierce. "This is over. Tonight. You're going to tell me everything, who's involved, where the meeting's happening, and how I can stop it." Pierce's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're not going to get away with this. You think you're the only one who knows how to fight dirty?" Frank's hand dropped to his sidearm, the cold steel reassuring under his fingers. "You've had enough power, Pierce. Now it's my turn. You're going to tell me where the meeting is. And when you do, I'll make sure you don't leave here alive." There was a beat of silence, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. Frank could see the calculation in Pierce's eyes. The man was dangerous, smart, always 3 steps ahead. But Frank had learned the art of outthinking the enemy long ago. He wasn't afraid of Pierce's threats. What scared Pierce was that he didn't have control anymore. Pierce looked away for a moment, then back at Frank. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, his defiance weakening. "The meeting's at the Regal Tower," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You won't get there in time though. You're already too late." Frank's eyes never wavered. "The Regal Tower," he repeated, committing the name to memory. "And who's going to be there?" Pierce smirked, the expression like poison. "Politicians, business owners, judges, all the people who run this city. You're not going to stop them. They'll protect me. And once I'm in control, you'll be forgotten." Frank's jaw tightened, the pressure of the moment building. Pierce had told him what he needed to know, but Frank wasn't done. He wasn't just going to walk out of here without finishing this. "I'm not letting you walk away from this," Frank said quietly, his voice calm but filled with a sense of finality. "This city is mine now." Pierce's expression flickered, a brief flash of fear crossing his face. "You don't have the guts to kill me, Frank. You're just an old man who's running out of time." Frank stepped back and drew his weapon, his hand steady as he aimed the gun directly at Pierce's chest. "I've killed before. And I'll do it again if it means protecting this city. You've caused enough pain. It's time to end it." For a moment, the two men stood there, their gazes locked. Frank could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the tension thick in the air. Pierce had taken everything, his city, his family, his life. And now, Frank was going to make sure Pierce paid for it all. But before Frank could pull the trigger, a sharp noise broke the silence, a door slamming open behind him. Frank spun around instinctively, his hand moving to his sidearm. In the doorway stood a figure, a man in a suit, flanked by several of Pierce's guards, all armed and ready for a fight. "Not so fast, Frank," the man said, a smirk on his lips. "You didn't think you could take down Pierce so easily, did you?" Frank's heart sank, but he didn't hesitate. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He was up against the system, a man who had spent years building it. Pierce wasn't just a criminal, he was a force that had infected every corner of the city. But Frank wasn't afraid. With a quick motion, Frank ducked behind cover, returning fire as the guards advanced. The gunfire erupted in the room, loud and chaotic, as Frank fought to stay alive long enough to finish what he had started. He couldn't afford to back down. He couldn't afford to lose. Not now. The fight was on. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mansion as Frank ducked behind a large leather chair, his mind racing. The guards were fast, too fast, and Frank knew they wouldn't stop until he was taken down. They were part of Pierce's network, just as corrupt and ruthless as the man himself. Frank's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was razor-sharp. He had no choice but to finish this. There was no running now. The only way out was through. Frank peeked around the chair, his eyes scanning the room. The guards were taking up positions trying to flank him, but Frank knew their movements. He had been trained to read the smallest of details, the shift in a guard's posture, the sound of a boot scraping against the floor. He was already planning his next move. This wasn't a fight he could win with sheer force alone. He needed to outsmart them. One of the guards moved forward, too focused on the space where Frank had been moments before. Frank acted in an instant, rolling out from behind cover and popping up behind the man. With a quick, clean motion, he knocked the guard's gun out of his hand, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby table. The other guards turned, momentarily distracted by the sound of their comrade hitting the ground. It was enough. Frank fired 2 quick shots, each one finding its mark as 2 of the remaining guards dropped to the floor. But the chaos of the moment was brief. The last guard ducked behind a large pillar, returning fire. Frank's breath quickened, his muscles tense as the gunfire continued to crack through the air. He had to move. He had to get closer. In a swift movement, Frank sprinted toward a hallway just behind the room, his eyes darting back to check for the guard. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit, and it was a perfect place to set a trap. He could hear the guard's footsteps following him, the echoes growing louder as the distance closed. Frank slid into a small alcove just as the guard entered the hallway, his gun raised and ready. Frank didn't hesitate. He leapt forward, knocking the guard's weapon to the ground before slamming him into the wall. The guard grunted in surprise, but Frank was already 2 steps ahead, his elbow making contact with the man's jaw. With a final, powerful twist, Frank disarmed him and knocked him unconscious with a single blow. The room fell silent again, the stillness broken only by Frank's heavy breathing. He was surrounded by the bodies of the men who had tried to stop him, but there was no time to revel in the small victory. Pierce was still out there, and the meeting at the Regal Tower was still happening. Frank knew that everything was riding on this final push. He couldn't let up now. He grabbed one of the guards' radios, tuning it to the frequency he had overheard earlier. A low, crackling voice came through the speaker. "All units report to the Regal Tower. The meeting begins in 30 minutes. Secure the perimeter." Frank's heart skipped a beat. 30 minutes. He didn't have much time. He took a deep breath, the weight of what he had to do pressing down on him. The Regal Tower was where it all started. Pierce's last stand. If he didn't act now, everything would fall into place for Pierce. Frank wasn't going to let that happen. He had one chance to stop this madness. With the radio still in his hand, Frank stepped over the fallen bodies and headed for the exit, his eyes narrowing with determination. He wasn't going to let Pierce get away with this. Not now. Not ever. Frank pulled up to the Regal Tower just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. The towering building loomed before him, its windows reflecting the city's darkening skyline. Frank knew what he was walking into. This wasn't going to be a clean operation. It never was when you were up against a man like Pierce. But Frank wasn't going to back down. He had been fighting for too long and the cost of failure was too high. The guards at the entrance barely noticed Frank as he slipped through the crowd, his cab blending in with the traffic. The security at the Regal Tower was tight. No one got through without a reason. But Frank had done his homework. He knew the ins and outs of this place just like he knew every street in the city. He had learned the patterns, the routines, and now he was ready to exploit them. He moved quickly, slipping through the back doors of the building and into the service elevator. No one noticed him. No one stopped him. The people at the top of the tower didn't care about the man who drove a cab, and Frank was counting on that. He didn't have time to waste. He had a job to do. As the elevator hummed upward, Frank checked his weapon, making sure it was loaded and ready. He wasn't taking any chances. The stakes were higher than ever. Pierce and his associates were already inside, preparing for the meeting that would solidify their control over the city. But Frank had other plans. The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor, and Frank stepped out, his eyes scanning the lavish lobby. The room was opulent, with glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city below. But there was no time to admire the view. Frank knew the meeting was just down the hall, behind a set of double doors guarded by 2 heavily armed men. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This was the final showdown. No more second chances. Frank had to take Pierce down now or the city was lost. As he approached the doors, Frank's hand went to his gun. The two guards at the entrance didn't even see him coming. In one swift motion, Frank dispatched them both, silently, efficiently. The doors opened and Frank stepped inside. What he saw took him by surprise. There were no ordinary men in this room. The meeting wasn't just filled with thugs and criminals. There were businessmen in suits, politicians with their hands in dirty pockets, and judges who had already sold their souls. Pierce was standing at the head of the table, surrounded by his inner circle. And there, in the center of it all, was Frank's city. It was everything Frank had feared. This was Pierce's vision for the future. A city ruled by fear, where corruption was the norm and the law meant nothing. But Frank wasn't done. Not yet. He stepped forward, his gun trained on Pierce. "This is where it ends, Pierce," Frank said, his voice calm, filled with the certainty of a man who had already made his decision. Frank stood at the threshold of the room, his gun aimed steadily at Pierce, who was now standing in front of the long, polished conference table. The room fell silent, the weight of Frank's presence hanging thick in the air. His gaze swept over the faces around the table, familiar faces from the city's elite, all of them complicit in Pierce's empire. Judges, businessmen, law enforcement officials. All of them had their hands dirty, all of them had sold their souls for power. And in the center of it all, Pierce stood as if he were untouchable, as if he were invincible. But Frank knew better. No one was untouchable. Not anymore. "Frank," Pierce said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "You've come a long way. But this is where it ends. You don't have the resources to take me down. You don't have the power." Frank's eyes never wavered. He had heard these words before from men like Pierce. Men who thought they were above the law, men who had controlled everything for so long that they believed they could never be defeated. But Frank wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid. And he had something Pierce didn't: determination. "I'm not here to play games," Frank replied, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to finish what I started. Your empire ends tonight, Pierce. And you're going to pay for everything you've done." The men around the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking nervously from Frank to Pierce. They knew what Frank was capable of. They knew he wasn't just some man who had walked into the room, he was a force. A man who had brought down far bigger enemies than Pierce. And now it was Pierce's turn. Pierce didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, his eyes cold, calculating. "You think you can just waltz in here, gun drawn, and stop me? Do you know how many people I have in my pocket? Do you think you can just eliminate me and walk away?" Frank's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. He had heard enough of Pierce's threats. He was done with talk. He wasn't going to waste any more time. Without a moment's hesitation, Frank stepped forward, his gun aimed straight at Pierce's chest. "This isn't a negotiation," Frank said, his voice hard. "You're done. The city's done. Your empire falls here." The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension hung thick in the air. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't blink. The men at the table were staring at him now, some of them with fear in their eyes, others with anger, but none of them made a move. They knew what Pierce meant to them, but they also knew the game was over. They could see the determination in Frank's eyes, the same fire that had burned in him since the moment he walked away from his old life. Pierce's smile faltered just for a second. He wasn't used to people standing up to him like this. He wasn't used to being threatened. But even in that moment he didn't back down. "You think you can take me down? You're nothing, Frank," Pierce sneered, his voice venomous. "A washed-up ex-agent with no backup. You can't win this." But Frank wasn't listening anymore. He had heard all the talk, all the threats, and it was clear to him now that Pierce wasn't just a criminal. He was a coward. And like all cowards, Pierce was trying to talk his way out of it. "You're wrong," Frank said quietly, his voice steady as a rock. "You've lost. And I'm taking you down." Before Pierce could respond, Frank moved, his gun aimed at the nearest man at the table, a high-ranking official whose face was filled with fear. Frank didn't hesitate, firing a warning shot into the ceiling. The men at the table froze, their hands instinctively rising in the air. "You're not in control anymore," Frank said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "This city isn't yours to destroy. Not anymore." The men around the table didn't move. They were paralyzed, caught between fear and the realization that the system they had built was about to collapse. Pierce's empire, the thing that had controlled their lives for so long, was crumbling right in front of them. Pierce's face twisted in anger, but Frank could see the fear now. He wasn't the confident, untouchable man he had been moments before. The game had changed, and Pierce was realizing it too late. "I won't go down without a fight," Pierce growled, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're making a mistake, Frank. You have no idea what you're up against." Frank stepped closer, his eyes hard and unyielding. "I know exactly what I'm up against. And I've made my peace with it." The silence in the room was deafening. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed to echo in the space between them. And then, with a speed that surprised even Pierce, Frank struck. His gun was already lowered, and with one swift motion, he grabbed Pierce by the collar and slammed him against the table. The force of the impact made the glasses shake, the papers scatter, but Frank wasn't letting go. "You're done, Pierce," Frank spat, his voice cold as ice. "I'm taking you down, and I'm taking everyone down with you. Your empire ends tonight." For the first time in a long while, Pierce's confidence faltered. He struggled against Frank's grip, but Frank was relentless. His hands were like iron around Pierce's throat, and he wasn't going to stop until he got the answers he needed. "Where's the meeting?" Frank demanded, his voice like a knife. "Tell me where it's happening and don't lie to me." Pierce's breath came in short gasps as he looked into Frank's eyes. He knew that Frank wasn't bluffing. He knew that Frank had the power to bring him down. And for the first time, Pierce realized that it was over. The game was finished. With a wheeze, Pierce spoke, his voice low and ragged. "The Regal Tower," he managed to choke out. "The meeting, it's happening there. Tomorrow night." Frank didn't wait for him to finish. He already knew what he needed to. With a swift motion, Frank released his grip, letting Pierce collapse onto the table. The fight was over. The information Frank needed was finally in his hands. Pierce's words echoed in Frank's mind, but he couldn't afford to dwell on them for long. The Regal Tower. That was where everything would end. Pierce's empire, which had controlled the city for so long, was teetering on the edge. Frank had taken down its muscle, its enforcers, and now he was about to take down its kingpin. But Frank wasn't naive. He knew that Pierce wouldn't go down without a fight. Even if Frank had gotten the information he needed, there were still countless pieces of Pierce's network spread throughout the city. And Frank couldn't afford to miss a single one. With one last glance at Pierce, who was now clutching his throat, gasping for breath, Frank turned and headed for the exit. There was no time to waste. The Regal Tower wasn't far. He had to act quickly if he was going to stop Pierce's meeting before it even began. As Frank made his way out of the mansion, his mind worked on overdrive. The clock was ticking. He had no backup, no team. This had to be a one-man operation. But Frank had always thrived in these kinds of situations. The stakes had never been higher, and the enemy had never been more dangerous. The city was about to change. Pierce had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated Frank. Frank had been in the game long enough to know that the biggest threat didn't come from the guns, the money, or the power. It came from the people who thought they were untouchable. And Pierce, with all his arrogance and his corruption, was no exception. The Regal Tower gleamed against the darkened skyline, a beacon of wealth and power in the heart of the city. Frank could feel the weight of it on his shoulders as he approached, the looming structure a symbol of everything Pierce had built. Every step Frank took toward the tower was a step closer to the end. He knew it wasn't just about taking down Pierce, it was about taking down the system that had allowed him to flourish in the first place. Frank parked his cab a few blocks away, blending into the city's rhythm. He wasn't going to walk in through the front doors. That would be too obvious. Instead, he made his way to a side entrance, a small service door that he had scouted earlier. He wasn't here for a show. He wasn't here to make noise. Frank Thompson was here to finish the job. The security at the side entrance was tight, but Frank had anticipated that. He moved swiftly, his fingers working with precision as he bypassed the lock. The door creaked open, but Frank was already inside, his feet moving silently against the marble floors. The Regal Tower was more than just an office building. It was a fortress, and Frank was about to breach it. He moved through the corridors with practiced ease, his every sense alert to the possibility of danger. The air was thick with tension, but Frank's mind was clear. He had one goal: get to the meeting and stop Pierce from solidifying his control. The building was eerily quiet as Frank ascended the elevator to the top floors. He could hear the faint hum of the building's electrical systems, the quiet hiss of air conditioning, but there were no sounds of life. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the top floor. Frank stepped out, his eyes scanning the hallway. He was close now. He could feel the heat of the moment building. He had no idea how many people were in the meeting room, but he knew it didn't matter. He had come this far and there was no turning back. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, and Frank could hear muffled voices inside. It was them. The meeting had already begun. He could make out snippets of conversation, but he couldn't afford to waste time eavesdropping. The voices would soon realize they were no longer alone. Frank's hand tightened around the handle of his gun, and he took one final breath before he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was filled with faces that Frank recognized: men and women of power, politicians, businessmen, law enforcement figures. They were all there, gathered around a table discussing Pierce's plans. Pierce himself sat at the head of the table, his smug smile as sharp as ever. But this time it wasn't enough to save him. The moment the door opened, all eyes turned to Frank. There was a split second of disbelief, a moment where the room collectively realized that they weren't in control anymore. Frank didn't give them a chance to react. "Everybody down?" Frank barked, his gun raised. The men and women at the table froze, fear and confusion spreading across their faces. But Frank wasn't giving them the opportunity to make a move. He was already stepping inside, his eyes fixed on Pierce, who was now standing up, his expression one of anger and disbelief. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me?" Pierce shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Frank. The city is mine. I own everything." Frank's gaze never left Pierce's. "Not anymore," he said, his voice cold and final. "This is over. Your empire ends tonight." The room was tense, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Frank was calm. He had been in situations like this before, situations where everything hinged on a single moment. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Pierce stepped forward, his hands raised in a vain attempt to assert dominance. "You're too late, Frank. Even if you kill me, even if you stop this meeting, it's too late to stop what's coming. You can't save this city." Frank didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He knew the truth. Pierce had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. As Frank stepped closer, Pierce reached for something beneath the table, his fingers moving toward a hidden gun. But Frank was faster. With a single shot, he sent the gun flying out of Pierce's hand, the weapon clattering to the floor. Pierce stumbled back, his face pale. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice shaking with disbelief. "I know I've won," Frank said, his eyes locked onto Pierce's. "You're finished, and so is your empire." Pierce staggered back, his face twisted with rage and fear. He had been caught off guard, the weight of his own hubris finally crashing down around him. The gun, which had once been his symbol of control, now lay useless on the floor, discarded and forgotten. Frank stood over him, unwavering. This was the moment everything had been leading to. No more games, no more manipulation. Frank had come to destroy Pierce's empire, and he wasn't leaving without ensuring that it crumbled for good. "I told you," Frank said, his voice low and controlled, "it's over." The room was eerily silent, the tension palpable. The men and women seated around the table, once so confident in their power, now looked terrified. Pierce's empire had relied on fear, on manipulation, and on the belief that they were untouchable. But Frank had proved them wrong. "You think you can take all of this down?" Pierce sneered, his voice shaking with defiance. "You think you can just walk in here, kill me, and everything will change? You're nothing, Frank. You're just a ghost from a past that's long gone." Frank stepped closer, his hand still steady on his gun. "No, Pierce. I'm not the ghost. You are. You've been living in the shadows, pulling strings, making deals with people who were too afraid to stand up to you. But not anymore. You're not untouchable. And now the city knows it." The group of conspirators at the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Frank and Pierce. Frank could see the cracks beginning to form. The illusion of power was fading fast. He wasn't just taking down one man, he was dismantling the entire system that had allowed men like Pierce to thrive for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but tonight was a pivotal moment. The tipping point. "You'll never get away with this," Pierce spat, his voice growing more desperate. "You think you've won? You think the city will turn on me? You're just a washed-up old agent with no allies. No one cares about you anymore." Frank's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You're wrong, Pierce. I have more allies than you could ever imagine. And tonight your empire ends." Frank moved toward the table, gesturing to the other figures in the room. "You all thought you could hide behind Pierce's power, didn't you? All of you, complicit in his schemes. His money, his influence, his manipulations. But that stops now." The room was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, the men and women began to shift uncomfortably. The bravado they once held was fading. Fear had replaced it. They knew what was happening. They knew Frank wasn't going to stop. And they also knew that the world they had once controlled was slipping through their fingers. One of the men at the table, a prominent businessman with a nervous twitch, stood up slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Frank, I didn't know it would go this far. I just wanted to make money. I wasn't part of all of this," he stammered. Frank didn't even acknowledge him. He kept his eyes on Pierce. "It's too late for apologies. You had your chance." Frank's mind was working fast. He knew what he had to do next. The people in this room had been complicit in Pierce's operation, and now it was time to hold them accountable. One by one, the corrupt officials, business owners, and judges would fall, but that would take time. The hard work was only just beginning. Frank turned to Pierce, his face hardening. "You're finished, Pierce. This whole city is waking up. The truth is going to come out. Every deal you've made, every person you've bribed, it's all going to be exposed. And you're going to rot in prison for the rest of your life." Pierce's defiance was gone now, replaced with pure, unmasked fear. "You won't survive this, Frank. They'll come for you. They'll come for you all." "I'm not running anymore, Pierce," Frank replied, his voice as cold as the steel of the gun in his hand. "I've already taken the first step. And it's over for you." Before Pierce could respond, Frank turned to the group of conspirators. "You all can choose. Help me take down Pierce and this entire empire, or I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you are and what you've done." The room fell into a tense silence. Then, slowly, some of the men and women began to shift, glancing nervously at each other. Some remained silent, their heads down, unwilling to look Frank in the eye. Others, however, knew they had no choice. The pressure of the moment was too much. One by one, the group began to speak, admitting their involvement in Pierce's empire. The promises of wealth, power, and immunity had blinded them. But now, in the cold light of Frank's determination, they realized they had no future in the world Pierce had built. Frank had broken the illusion. And the walls around Pierce were collapsing. Hours later, Frank stood in front of the towering windows of the Regal Tower, looking out at the sprawling city beneath him. The meeting had ended, but the aftermath was just beginning. The corrupt officials who had been part of Pierce's network were already being detained, their ties to the criminal empire exposed for all to see. The media had already begun reporting on the busts, the arrests, and the unraveling of Pierce's once powerful network. Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he answered it without looking. "It's done," he said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of finality. Benny's voice came through the line, a quiet but relieved tone. "I thought this day would never come, Frank. You did it. You actually brought him down." Frank smiled faintly, a tired but content expression crossing his face. "We did it, Benny. The city's free now." Pierce, the man who had controlled the city from the shadows for so long, was gone. His empire had crumbled, and the corrupt politicians, business leaders, and criminals who had stood behind him had been exposed. The city was beginning to heal, but Frank knew that there was still work to do. The fight for justice wasn't over, it would never be over. But tonight it felt like a victory. For Frank Thompson, the city's silent protector, the weight of the world had finally been lifted. And as he looked out at the skyline, the city that had been suffocated by Pierce's control seemed to breathe once more. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.